Welcome to another episode of Rooftop Conversations. So, the person I have on today for my episode is a young woman I met back in March. And funnily enough, we actually never met in real life. And every conversation we've had so far has been virtually because of course, the pandemic. Her and I both work with a campaign, and honestly, she has been a pleasure to work with. I am so honored to have gotten to know her and to work with her. And of course, she's a woman who wears many hats and has many talents. And I'm so proud to even have met her virtually. And it's interesting because I feel like I just clicked with her instantly. So please welcome on the show Sabina Unni to a Rooftop Conversation. So Sabina, I'm going to let you take it away because I think you're probably going to do a better intro about yourself than I could ever do you justice. So Sabina?
That was literally perfect. Yeah, we work on the same policy team together, and I also feel like we've known each other for a while and in person. I feel like I could list off a lot of facts about May if you asked me to. But yeah, I'm a urban planner in training, and I do theater. So I'm really excited for this conversation where I know we're gonna talk about both of those aspects of my life. And I'm also just like really excited to be on the show. I love watching May do these, so really fun.
It's so funny because it's like between our like late night, like 3 hour, 4 hour calls, we've gotten to know each other so well, and it definitely seems like it doesn't even seem like we met each other virtually. Like I keep thinking like I've met you in person, but then I forget sometimes
I
we actually
know.
never actually physically met, which is so funny.
The amount
But
of
it's like
frantic texts we've sent each other in environmental special use districts.
honestly at this point, like that's the beauty about working on a campaign is like you will get to really be close to the people you're working with on a team super quick because you're like forced to kind of work together like these long hours together. But you made it fun. Like you really made like it's my first campaign experience, like hands-on campaign experience, and I like really want to thank you and of course like the rest of the team, which I won't disclose who they are, but thank you for like really making it like amazing for me. So like you said, you're an urban planner and you're also in theater. So I'd love to ask and about your experiences. So, like, what motivated you to enter into a career in urban planning, and especially you have a career in environmental studies and like looking at urban spaces and urban planning in a green lens. So, what was the motivation for entering urban planning as a whole, but also why your motivation for specifically working on green spaces?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like I'm the kind of person who I had like 15 things I wanted to major in, and I couldn't pick which one. I was like, I want to major in bio and anthropology and environmental sciences and Spanish. And so that was always stress to me because I always found myself really interested in whatever classes I was taking. But when I started undergrad, I started as a political science and biochem major. I was like, all right, I'm gonna do policy, or I'm like gonna be a scientist, or like maybe some combination of the two of them. And then because I went to a liberal arts college, I took a bunch of interdisciplinary classes as well. So I took an anthropology class about urbanism. I took an environmental science class that was just introductory, and both of them I was like, wow, these are like really interesting, but like I'm going to stick to bio and political science. But I just kept going back to classes about like urbanism and classes about how the city works, and eventually kind of landed into that niche of understanding questions of space and place within different majors. So because like green environmental planning, it's like pretty interdisciplinary. There's not like one major that associates with it. I eventually was an anthropology major, and but I took a lot of like environmental science and bio classes along the way. And I wrote my thesis about kind of urban planning and how that's an opportunity for state violence when public spaces are really segregated and when neighborhoods are pretty segregated, which is kind of a basic idea. Like, okay, urban planning is violence when it's done in the wrong way. But because it was an anthropology thesis, I focused on like ancient Mexico City. So it was very like archaeological. So it feels very different than what I'm doing now, which is like policy with urban planning right now in New York City. And my thesis was policy in Mexico City in 1500. Also, let's use excavation reports. But it was a similar muscle on the whole idea of like, okay, how are states using these tools that we think of as really bureaucratic and really like super super modern and really like municipal as like really old tools of like power and who has control over space. So I did that. Then yeah, my journey with urban planning kind of, I feel like, started there, because even though I had like studied similar things throughout undergrad, I really feel like I was like, oh, I want to be an urban planner. This is really interesting to me. Seeing how it's used for all of these negative things, it's really important. And also just I feel like running in public spaces is another thing that I feel like really made me feel wanting to have some like access to urban space. There's this really interesting, like, I know this gets at a bunch of other topics, but there's this really interesting paper that talks about how like public space is really kind of just like white space. And I feel like, right? And I feel like running through space, if you're a woman of color, if like you don't look super like an normative thin running body, is very it teaches you about how space is exclusionary. It teaches you about how public spaces aren't designed for everyone in mind. They're designed for a really specific type of body. And so that also reminds you about the need to have kind of really diverse design aesthetics when you're doing urban design. Yeah, and so I work at this urban research company. I'm a research assistant there, and I've done other urban planning jobs as well. And yeah, I've really been lucky to work with a bunch of really progressive urban planners, where I found it to be like a diverse field, but also like everyone that I've worked with is really invested in having really like progressive and human centered and really like sustainable design.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up like equity and open spaces, right? I think like New York City, and I think I think you and I are gonna talk a lot about New York City just because it's our forte, being like New Yorkers. But we've seen segregation and exclusion in these open spaces, right? Because like in some places you have open spaces everywhere. I'm fortunate enough to live in downtown Brooklyn, which is I'm gonna say increasingly predominantly white neighborhood. Especially like I'm downtown Brooklyn adjacent Brooklyn Heights, which is like very, very white and very, very wealthy. So I'm privileged to have like access to all these open spaces. I like, and that's something like I even mentioned during COVID-19, like I'm privileged enough to like, even though gyms are closed, I'm able to go outside and work out and do these things because I have the access to open space, as opposed to folks who are in Southern Brooklyn or, you know, other Black and Brown communities in New York City. There's a lack of open space and accessible open space. And furthermore, even spaces like playgrounds can be exclusionary towards like kids with disabilities or mobility issues. We've seen open space be used in ways that like isn't beneficial to everyone. It historically it has been exclusionary as well. You know, we've seen how Black folks have been excluded from beaches and that usage, and also Central Park being, you know, another issue with like, you know, historically how it was like they took Black lands and Black neighborhoods to create this park, and then further excluding Black folks, even like unfortunately leading up to the incident with the Central Park Five, with the young men, and where they can't even afford to enjoy that open space, or even Christian Cooper, not Chris, sorry, not Christian Cooper. Is it Christian? Is it something? Oh my god! You know, because there were so many Coopers. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Christian Cooper, who wanted to use the open space of Central Park to birdwatch and wasn't allowed to do so without a threat from a white woman. So it's just interesting to see how these spaces are excluded. And then we see bike lanes, right? Like,
Yes.
you know, in Red Hook, it was a historically Black and brown neighborhood, and you never really see like safe infrastructure for Black and brown folks who do rely on biking, who do
Right.
rely on that as a way of transport. But yet, bike lanes were never made for them. Nothing safe was ever made for them to bike and get around. But when white folks started moving in, the city was like, okay, time for a protected bike lane. So that's just a long-winded way of me kind of asking you this next question. Um, how, in your opinion, has urban spaces been exclusionary for, like, you know, for folks, marginalized folks, especially like Black and brown folks, folks with accessibility issues? And also, how can we work to improve that equity, especially in a policy basis and a planning basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess off the bat, as you said, like I feel like public spaces are really like a space of violence, because for many Black and brown communities, like public parks are like a site of surveillance and where there's increased police presence, or where white folks like Amy Coopers of the world will feel licensed to call the cops on people just for really existing in public spaces. It's also a space of violence for women and gender nonconforming folks who have increased risk of sexual harassment and worse in public parks, and queer folks as well. So there's different ways to approach these problems. How do you make these spaces? How do you like make the right to the city for everyone? How do you make these spaces for everyone, not just for white folks or not just for people who are able-bodied? And so there's ways of like thinking about it in terms of larger systemic issues. There's design solutions. I feel like there's a lot. I feel like to me design solutions feel like an easy fix, but I feel like what they are is like they're a way of reconceptualizing space. So it's like that's like larger problematizing the issue. So a lot of urbanists will suggest things like having better sight lines. Like there shouldn't be places in a park where you can't see your surroundings. You should be able to see how to exit. You should have clear lamps and better lighting. You should have more benches so that the space is friendlier. So you have better kind of amenities in the park. It shouldn't, you should hire people to be park stewards so that you can A, create jobs, and B, like you don't have a dirty open space. You have something that's really clean and accessible. So that's making parks like safer is a design challenge, but it's also like, okay, you also need to make it so that there aren't more police in parks. You don't want people to feel constantly surveilled and then more likely for bad things to happen, because that's what happens when you have more police in parks. You also want to make sure that there isn't one public park. So I'm very nerdy, so I love doing maps. I also feel like people have done full dissertations about like what is the distribution of public parks in New York City. But I also was like, I want to download a shapefile of all the public parks in the city, and then I overlaid it on the censuses. They divide all the neighborhood into neighborhood tracts. And so I looked at the populations and then racial breakdowns of populations for each of the neighborhood tracts in the city. And I looked at the parks, and like, obviously the parks, the places where there's like the highest concentration of brown and black folks and the highest concentration of people, period, is always where there's the least amount of public parks. Obviously there are some exceptions to that, but like the whole idea of like public spaces are kind of designed for people who are more affluent and who are whiter is not very surprising. But the people who are urban designers are always really challenged. They're like, well, sometimes when we have increased public spaces and more nice green spaces in low-income areas, then that is how gentrification happens, because then more people will come into these neighborhoods and raise the cost of living and push the people who should be living in these neighborhoods out of the neighborhoods. So I don't know, a policy suggestion that people who I really respect suggest is like conscious anti-gentrification in the greening process. So a lot of that involves community-based planning, which I feel like is the best overall solution to how do we have more equitable green open spaces. It's like urban planning is not this like, it is design solutions, but it's not like trying to find a hack. It's about trying to find like a community dialogue. It's about trying to say like, okay, this is our space. How do we cooperatively own this space? And how do we cooperatively decide to use this space? And that involves like, does this neighborhood want to form like a working group or a task force where we discuss how do we stop harassment of young women in these public areas? How do we have more accessible public plazas so that there isn't, people who are drinking in these areas, so then people call the cops and then there's increased violence and surveillance of immigrant communities? Or like, how do you have more playgrounds that are really safe? What are the priorities of the neighborhood? And then when you have community-based planning, you're less likely to have gentrification because it's community needs. It's not like what a startup wants in these public spaces. It's what people who live in spaces want. And that also like has to go hand in hand with progressive policies like rent control and stabilization and more increased affordable public housing. Like if you don't want gentrification to happen in these areas when you have increased green spaces, then you need to have housing policies that match that. And you need to have food system policies that match that. You can't just, work in one of these areas without each other. But they're really tough questions. I think I'm answering it as if I'm like, I know all the solutions, but I'm like, these are really hard questions. These are just my my brief foray into urban planning has given me strong opinions and the overconfidence to believe that I have the answers to some of these, which I obviously don't. But I am passionate about, green open spaces. And I feel like every time I go into a public park, I feel like hyper conscious of like when there's like surveillance or when I feel like, oh, this place, like, why is this completely enclosed off from any other pathways and it's really dark? But I'm also like, hey, like this is a iterative process and we're all like learning how to make safer public spaces for everyone.
No, definitely, I agree. As someone who lives in like kind of a waterfront neighborhood, like northern Brooklyn is one of those sites where open spaces had well, not I don't want to say open spaces, but like space has been repurposed for another use, and it has. I mean, clearly, as you see from the background, tons of luxury developments are now being put in place. So I definitely can agree. Like with Brooklyn Bridge Park, originally Dumbo was a manufacturing industrial area, and there was like a lot of space there. It wasn't like as developed, but like it was just a lot of like warehouses and people were working there. It's also adjacent to a lot of NYCHA properties, not adjacent, but kind of like nearby a lot of NYCHA properties in Vinegar Hill and like Fort Greene. However, they decide to. I don't know who was necessarily involved with like Brooklyn Bridge Park, but they basically like redeveloped it, and now like there's like luxury hotels and luxury bars, and it's super expensive to even live down there now. I mean, granted that area was always like wealthier, but like it is now like skyrocketed like into the millions to live on that shoreline. And like you've seen it in Williamsburg, you've seen it in Greenpoint, you've seen it in the Lower East Side and True Bridges, where these waterfront areas are now being like, oh, let's do it for open space, let's do this, and like we're gonna do it for the community. But those are prime examples of like which kind of is counter to what you were saying, right? Like community-based planning. It's very counter to that. It's more of we're gonna bring all these like businesses in, these developers in, redevelop the front land, say it's open space, and we're doing it for the people, but yet they're skyrocketing all these prices in the surrounding land. And I do agree. I think like community place planning is super, super crucial to urban planning, right? We've seen urban planning go wrong in New York City so many times. Like we've seen how Robert Moses has basically segregated the entire city with like the use of the FDR Drive and the different highways, you know, environmental racism. We can go on about that,
We can
but
go
we see
on.
we can go on about how racist urban planning is, and it
It is
continues to
so
be
crazy.
racist.
It is. It does. It absolutely does.
Yeah, like we've seen it with like the flaws of the ULURP process, which is the for folks who
Yes.
don't know, it's the uniform land use review procedure, which is a procedure that was put in place for people to comment, but it doesn't really take into the needs of the community. And we can go on about community boards being like very
Yes.
exclusive, but yeah, I definitely agree. Like urban planning needs to be based on the community. Like while you don't have the answers, you're definitely on the right track, and I think that is so crucial in our planning process, right? Like we can't just think about open space, open space, open space without
Right.
thinking the other factors involved with it, affordable housing, gentrification, lack of small businesses, and those are important to our conversation. Which goes on to my next question. When COVID-19 hit and people were kind of like, so one of the biggest questions was redefining like New York City open spaces and how we use them and all of that. And like it even led to kind of the mayor opening and closing off like certain streets in different boroughs to create more open space for folks to, get out of their house, especially with the weather being hot and people don't want to be inside. It's like he kind of opens up like these different blocks for people to like congregate but social distance. I don't know. Like he came up with all these different
Right.
things, um, but I would love to know from your opinion, what do you think, like how in a I don't want to say post COVID because it's kind of weird to say post COVID, right? Because I feel like we're still in the COVID world, but like with COVID happening and now people are looking into this expanded use of like open space and congregation and how people can be outside while being safe and all of that. How do you see like New York tackling this problem? Like, especially creating spaces where open space like parks aren't necessarily accessible for everyone. Like so somewhere like the Bronx where um I think that was like one of those places where I'm only saying this is anecdotal from like a coworker who lives up there, so this is not even like facts, but I know like for her neighborhood they closed off like different blocks because there was a lack of open space. So I'd love to hear like what's your opinion and like how can we bring more equity into this?
Yes.
Or in like creating open spaces, like how can we like we can't just dig up a property and create like a new central park, but like what do you think we can do to generate more open spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I do for fun is I go through the mayors and the New York City, just the New York City government has this page where they just have a bunch of data that you can pull and play with that has to do with like urban planning, basically. And so they have this shapefile, which is like the kind of file that gives you a polygon or like a series of points of some certain kind of data. And I was actually playing with it yesterday, and it was all the open spaces that were created because of COVID. And so unsurprisingly, they're so concentrated in Manhattan, which already has a ton of open space and lots of like parks compared to like the size of it. Very few in Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx, and like throughout the rest of New York State. So I guess the first thing that comes to mind with like open streets is prioritizing the whole city and actually prioritizing, communities where there are fewer public parks and where there are fewer playgrounds and where there's a higher density of people, right? There's so many organizations that like create these park indices and analyze parks and say, does this park meet the standards that we've created, right? Obviously biased because like, how do you determine what's a good public space or not? But these are people who are like really thinking about their metrics. They're like, is it clean? Is it safe for, women and young children and gender nonconforming folks? Is it, are there lots of sightlines? Whatever. So they use all these different metrics. Is there a lot of flora and fauna? And so there's ways to partner with like organizations who have rated neighborhoods on, are people basically, I think the general question is, are people a 5-minute walk from a nice public park? And by nice, I mean just like equitable and open, not nice as in like white and gentrified. So having more open spaces that are not just in Manhattan, that are open streets. I think the Open Streets program, like theoretically, is really great. The idea of closing off we cede so much public space to cars that like we don't need to, like, and COVID also reminded us like we have the capacity to reclaim streets and like take more streets up. So continuing the idea of open streets, bringing it more thoroughly to other boroughs where there's a better need for public spaces. I think there used to be so many open streets programs that the mayor's office would do. So they used to have like really careful play streets where they would close off streets so that kids could play during the day in the summer. They would have lots of like senior walk programs. They would like give funding to these as well. Like obviously these things always happen, but like if there's not funding and also not like sometimes institutional support behind it, it happens more informally and less regularly. So funding for that, funding for like block parties and funding for like street fairs and funding and like not surveilling and criminalizing food vendors on the street who are almost always men of color and immigrants. And having kind of the best way to like make open spaces and open streets in urban areas better is making them more pedestrian friendly and making them like more accessible and make I like worked on this project and it was like, how do we get people to use transportation more or to use cars less? And part of the answer was like, we need to acquaint people with streets and like have people feel safe walking on the street, have people not just feel safe like walking on the street, not fear that they'd like get hit by a car or have something bad happen to them, but also want to walk around and want to feel comfortable in their neighborhood and feel like they're being provided like fun, spontaneous things. I feel like a big thing in urban planning is like, how do we continue to make the city really like fun and spontaneous and like not criminalizing people who are like selling things on the street and not shutting down block parties and like making a noise complaint, right? Allowing people to do fun things in streets is a way to like naturally kind of create open space and encourage people to use open streets. But it's a really hard question because like when you need to be social distancing, how do you use public spaces, right? The two of those are very antithetical, but like creating more open space so that people are able to have more distancing is a pretty good solution, right? So that you're able to spread out more and not be like, I feel like I saw those pictures in Washington Square Park and it's a bunch of like white hipsters who are like sitting like 1 feet away from each other. And like the more open spaces we create though, hopefully the less likely things like this are going to happen. And also like more people who like don't live really close to parks will have long-term benefits of having access to this, which is like, parks are so important, not just because they buffer climate change. I'm also made a tweet about this where parks are really important because they're a place where anybody can cry, which is really true. I love crying in public parks, very privately, right? Don't want to ruin the vibe. But they're really good because like, they're a place where people can gather and like build community and like having plazas and public spaces is how you build community and how you feel neighborly and like allows you to have public programming there. The policy, we work in policy in a district where there's a really successful neighborhood plaza and that's allowed for a lot of community programmings and like allowing for like events that like highlight the religious diversity of the district and like cause people to feel neighborly because you have this communal gathering site. And it's just like in a home, if you live in a home and there's a kitchen, like you have this communal gathering site, you don't feel so isolated, you feel really in community with people. So making sure that we continue these even as COVID continues to kind of hurt the city, like having these spaces is such a priority.
I definitely agree. Like I think like what New York lacks is that like or at least not I don't think New York lacks it. I think New York is a very great community based like town. New Yorkers I think in my opinion are the nicest people to ever come into the world. But people want to disagree with me on that. But I think New Yorkers are sweet. We're just very blunt, but we're very sweet. We're very sweet. But I think like when people think of New York, people don't think of community spaces, right? As opposed to the smaller town. But
Right,
like there like I think like the two like last like open like public open free non-private like non-capitalist spaces that we do have left are parks and the libraries, right?
right,
Those are basically the two only like remaining free open spaces for people to use. And like it's I agree. I think open spaces generate this community bond, increases like safety comes with like knowing your neighbors, knowing your
right,
community, talking to people around you, and also like it's a space for like community and learning and like being together, right? I know for like in my neighborhood we have a park, you can probably see over there, the green space over there. It's called Cabin Plaza. It's actually been the site of a lot of the BLM protests and movements, and different teach-ins have happened there, and people have gathered in solidarity with the movement. And same with Borough Hall, which is kind of like a plaza where
right.
folks actually come and gather and learn about things. And these are great for activist movements when the cops don't want to be annoying. Um, when it's like when cops don't want to get involved, when it's just the people doing their thing, it's it's a great space to use. And once again, it goes back into surveillance and policing and all that, right? Like let if like there are spaces where people can just gather and feel safe, be with each other, be with like their community, these are spaces that would amplify or at least like benefit any neighborhood, and it should be promoted. It kind of hurts because like I think a few months earlier when like I think in April or May, when they were doing park budgets, and I kind of like listened into the hearing just to see what they were talking about, and everyone's like, programming is slashed because we don't have COVID money, and staffers are slashed because we don't have because COVID. We have to also cut back down on like people cleaning because COVID. But you know what's? And then people are like, and then like someone was like, oh, but like how about like if we're gonna open beaches, if we're gonna open pools, like how people are gonna like enforce social distancing? And someone was like, "Don't worry, we're still gonna have money. The city has agreed to include more law enforcement for parks." And I'm like, okay, so like the one thing in the parks budget that isn't getting slashed
It's the thing that
is
should
law
be.
enforcement. It's something that should be exactly. And it's like wait, so you're gonna cut down
Jesus.
people that work there, the cleaning, the facilities, like the bathrooms, but not the cops. And I don't know. The city has its priorities all mixed up,
Yes, and also
and
public libraries and public parks both like provide community infrastructure like water drinking fountains, public bathrooms, all these access to like things that you need during the day. Those are the things like when they're in disrepair, they don't act as like these public resource centers, which is also terrible. Also,
I agree.
yeah, I love that the thing that we do for fun is I look at data from and you look at hearings.
No, that one I did for work. That hearing I did it for my old job. But like,
May
but no,
just
no.
like reading on the budget.
But still, like, I feel like I have like my nerdy like hobbies, which is like I think everybody in policy has,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Like, you don't shut off. Your
We were
brain doesn't shut
definitely
off.
we were definitely live texting during the budget. We were like, "Who
We
voted?"
were we were like, it was like live texting, live tweeting. All this is like literally policy geeks in New York City. Oh my god.
Yeah.
But I think I mean for policy folks, right? This is like our city. This is where we live, and I think for us, like we have an invested stake in this. For young people, this parks are a place where, and like I'm including us and young people. I don't care what
Yes.
anyone says. Like we are young people, okay? Like, but even for like teens and kids and like people our age, parks have been a space for kids to do things in the summer, to do things like for fun, to go bike riding, to go play basketball, to you know to I don't know what see I'm out of touch. Oh, even to gather, have picnics, play music, and things like that. And I feel like with COVID-19, I've actually seen more youth come out and like use these spaces as a way for them to gather it because like the typical spaces aren't there anymore. The
Right.
like movies, the bar, the restaurants, like things that people like young people have used to like enjoy themselves and have fun. It's not there, and
Yeah.
especially for like youth of color and like more like it's like we now like I mean parks have always been like a space for what I'll cut that out. I'm gonna have to cut like that. I'm gonna have to edit this one out. Like I don't know what I'm going with this, but yeah. Anyway, yeah, I think like at the end of the day, like there has to be more investment in our spaces. I think exactly what you said, planning, whether it's planning for open spaces or for affordable housing or for like even transportation infrastructure needs
Yeah.
to incorporate the needs of the community that they're putting the thing in. And I think that's what the city, in my opinion, fails to do. Um, I think that's how like just the processes and the bureaucracy that we have in place doesn't benefit everyone and it only benefits a select few. Like if you in this if like people in the city have had the idea to repurpose an old railway to create something like the High Line in Manhattan, there are ways to repurpose space or at least structures to create open spaces in other boroughs as well, in my
Right. Yeah, it's true. And it's like a larger, aside from all of the like very tangible benefits of open space that we've listed, from like site of protest to site of gathering,
opinion.
although there's overlap between those two, it's also just like a priority from the city of like, who do you value? Who deserves space? Who deserves access to this city? And so, it's really important to make sure that you say everyone has right to the city and everybody equally deserves to be valued in these spaces.
Definitely. And like honestly, the more the budget should go to things like resources and staff, because parks also provide jobs for the local community instead of putting in more. I don't even know the law enforcement. I'm just like, really, like this is the one thing you just have to keep. But anyway, shifting gears a bit, like because you and I can go on about open spaces and inequities in New York City
Forever.
forever because we do this for like a living. But I love to talk about. I think one of the things that actually like really one thing that I think well, one of the many things that I find really interesting about you is that you actually own your own production company. So you started a production company called Fresh Lime Soda Co. And I would love to hear in your words like what it is, and also like what was your motivation like behind starting this like production company.
Yeah, I feel like people are like urban planning and theater. These are really like disparate things, which when you think about it, yes, they are. I feel like my tagline would be like, well, they're both like participatory kinds of things. It's both about like communicating values in a joint space. So there's that. And but they're also about like equitizing access as well. My company is centered on South Asian theater makers. So we're all South Asian, and we do really politically motivated theater. So we do works that are like either like provoking or archiving or interacting with theater as resistance. That's a pretty broad concept. But like we're intentionally kind of broad in that like resistance can mean different things. It can mean doing a play that's like explicitly talking about like Hindu nationalism and fascism, or it can mean like more subtly, getting to concepts of Islamophobia and Orientalism when talking about a family drama. So yeah, it's really exciting. I started this, I co-founded it with a friend last year, and so we started pretty recently. And we've both been doing theater for a long time. I feel like I had been doing Shakespeare theater for a really long time. I love acting. I love performing. I'm a performer. Love an interview. And so me and my friend Kanka, we were in this Shakespeare troupe together where we did, but like Shakespeare is the whitest possible theater. And we had found the theater world to be so white, so exclusionary, really struggling to tell diverse narratives, also feeling really like pigeonholed in the diverse narratives we could tell. Like we could only like tell a story that was like about Indian guards, not about like, what if it's just like about somebody who, happens to be South Asian and just wants to talk about their life, or or something along that spectrum of experiences. So we were finding theater to be really non-nuanced, and stories not really told with care. That's really a broad brushstroke, but that's what our experience felt like. Just that there wasn't really like a niche home for South Asians in theater, and to be able to like more broadly like be storytellers and tell our narratives and like interact in a really participatory way with an audience about our narratives. So yeah, we did some productions before COVID in person, and now we're adapting to Zoom. I know you have questions about Zoom soon, but we do stage readings and performances over Zoom, and it's, plays mostly written by women and gender nonconforming folks, but also everyone as well. But we tend to have that focus, which is also great because if you notice the current South Asians who are in TV and media right now, they're almost all men, and half of their comedy is about how annoying brown women are, which only I can say brown women are annoying. Nobody else can say that. Yeah, so we do a lot of stage readings, a lot of development of new works and performances.
Yeah, I mean, like honestly, I think as a fellow content creator, I love it when like women or gender nonconforming folks, especially like those folks of color, are doing the media themselves and like handling everything on their own because like mainstream media isn't created for everyone, as we can see. Like I think like especially with like Asians and like South Asians, it's like so limited for a lot of folks to see like aside from like the stereotypical tropes and like the offensive tropes and things like that. Like I mean now like we have I don't know if you ever like heard of the show like Never Have I Ever. Mindy
Yes,
Kaling's like produced. Like that was like the first time I saw like, a South Asian like leading woman just doing like regular high school like
yes,
a high school comedy. Like I mean yes, there's like references to her culture, her faith, and things like that. But like it was just very like okay, she's just being a teenage girl in America, and it's just
right.
but yeah, and it's like awesome seeing that kind of media. And I love that you're doing that also with your production company, that like you are highlighting these stories and you're doing it in also a very refreshing way. Um, so like recently you mentioned like the whole how now like so obviously the entertainment the entertainment world and art and creativity has been severely impacted by COVID-19. Like spaces are closed, theaters, venues, and it's very difficult for and you obviously can't like put on a show in person without like social distancing. Like it's hard to like get people in a room to act and to do things. But you actually pulled it off really well on Zoom. So Sabina and the Fresh Lime Soda production company actually put on a Zoom, like all based on Zoom, based play of the Ramayana. And I hope I'm pronouncing it right because in Thai they have it in different pronunciations. So I hope I'm saying this right.
Very
But
good.
you like did it all on Zoom. It was like super. Like it was like such an innovative way to put on a show. Like I've never seen anything like it before, and I was just like watching it, like wow, like everything was so seamless or flawless. Like the acting was great. It took a lot of coordination. So I'd love to hear like your experiences, like what it was like to put on a Zoom only production. And like there was like not just one or two people reading. There was like a whole acting troupe, like behind the scenes music, background. It was just like wow, like how did you and Fresh Lime Co put this together? And I would love to hear like your experiences producing that.
That's a great question. Also, thanks so much for coming. I was so happy. May was like, "I'm here," and I was like, "Oh my god!" I shouldn't be texting right now, but I have to text my back. So yeah, I feel like off the bat when I was like thinking about Zoom plays, I was like, "Oh my god, this is gonna be so easy to do. It's gonna be low drama, low effort because it's on Zoom, and so like you can only kind of see part of a person. So that's like 25% of the work." Completely wrong. It is much harder to direct over Zoom in my opinion. There's so many things that you have to think about, from how do you make your event safe from Zoom bombers, especially if your play is going to be about Hindu nationalism or queering the epics. Those are topics that are going to make people mad. How do you lay security? To like really small things like people get fatigued really easily. How are you going to make sure that your plays are, like things like long pauses and meaningful eye contact, which are really powerful in a live theater, don't read at all over Zoom. They just read as like glitches, or they read as like people are like, okay, there's 30 seconds of silence. I am going to scroll through Instagram. Like, how do you become more interesting and desirable to the viewer than going on Instagram? Which for me is always hard because I love Instagram. I will choose Instagram over almost any activity, which I love saying. So yeah, it was. So the first thing that we started is we were really clear that we're like, okay, we want to accept new plays, we want to accept new progressive plays, and so my friend Dinesha was like, well, I'm writing this queer reimagining of the Ramayana, which is this like Hindu myth that is incredibly problematic and potentially the cause of a lot of Hindu nationalism. And so I was like, I would love to direct that. I would love to see I love modern reinterpretations of the canon. So I directed it and I cast and found some actors, many of which are New York City based because we're New York City based. But we were able to work with some people who were in California and who were in India and Malaysia, which we absolutely wouldn't have been able to do were it not for the pandemic. So we were able to have a really like global multicultural cast, which was exciting. And then so scheduling rehearsals is very tough in some ways, but it also was a lot easier because like so like everyone who was acting in the production tended to, work another job or have a part-time job at least. And so we wouldn't be able to have like a 3 p.m. rehearsal because everyone would be like, well, I'm in the office right now. But because everyone's schedules were really flexible, like, some people are working but like don't have any calls between like 12 and 2 or something like that. People were able to fit in a lot of like short 30-minute rehearsals during the day to like go over scenes. And a lot of the things from like directing a regular show were the same. Like you could say things like, all right, like you could like punch up jokes, or you could like work on a monologue and like, where are the dynamics in this one? What are the emphasis? What does your character want from that monologue? So that aspect of directing and like asking those questions from actors was the same. Almost everything else was different. Like transitions between scenes, instead of like, making it a big production, you kind of have to like, it's more of a tech coordination of like, how do you like click exit at the same time, and how do you make sure that there's not one awkward second where there's a person on the screen and then there's no one on the screen, and then so the transitions are awkward and like really hard to do. And I had a really big spreadsheet where I would read off people's transitions and where which everyone hated because they were like, wow, nobody wants to hear you read off a spreadsheet for 15 minutes. But also a big thing was audience participation. The most fun part of theater and maybe urban planning is the like participatory element, and you can't really have that over Zoom. So we worked really hard to like encourage people to be really active in the chat, and people were crazy in the chat. They were like really actively following along with it and messaging like walls, but also like really thoughtful responses during the performance. And then we were like, all right, we also want to have a discussion afterwards where anybody can talk, and everyone should turn on their videos and mics because like you're equally part of the performance. And so it's not the same in that like you don't feel someone like right next to you and feel like you're like in the performance, but hopefully there are some ways like with the Zoom chat with the discussion afterwards that you can kind of recreate the participatory thing. But I'm also like, in the grand scheme of the world, theater is not on anyone's, nor should it be, on anyone's priority of things that we should be reopening post COVID-19 or, during COVID-19. And I feel like a lot of theater people like saying like, how do we like get back to the way things are? And it's like, okay, like let's use this as an opportunity to not go back to things the way things are and like have new priorities about like, how do you do really diverse casting? You're able to cast a bunch of people in Malaysia because you're, space doesn't matter. How can theater? How can we bring the energy of like prioritizing participation back into the theater? Yeah. Well, it looks like I'm. Oh no.
Too.
Yes, and I'm like, yeah, but theater. A lot of people when they're talking about theater reopening are like begging. They're like, when is theater going to go back to the way things were? And I really miss how theater used to be. But we can use this kind of as an opportunity to take the best practices and new ideas from this like experiment in theater, in digital theater, and bring that same energy back into theater in person from like really thoughtful, diverse casting, like being able to cast people from like Malaysia and India and Pakistan who are never prioritized in casting, and those narratives are rarely prioritized, making sure that people from really diverse backgrounds are in, main roles and just like telling their stories with care. Or, audience participation, bringing that to the front, like community participation, community oriented plays. These are things that I feel like Zoom plays really prioritize that, IRL plays tend not to prioritize. And so bringing that kind of energy back and like not bringing things back to the way they used to be, but like kind of reimagining a new future of theater is really possible because of this.
Yeah, definitely. I think like what you did with Ramayana was like amazing. How you kind of casted all these very diverse actors and actresses, and you made it like it was a global thing. Like it wasn't just people in New York tuning in; it
Right.
was people in India, Malaysia. I think you said California that was tuning in as well. It was people from all around the world, and also like it's accessible, right? It's like a free
Right.
slash low cost performance. It was something that people who, regardless of class or like money, are able to like tune in and listen to. It's getting a different talent from everywhere to come together in a space. Like I think COVID-19 has brought in those like questions of like, can we make things accessible, like plays and like cultural performances more like easy for folks to access? I know like the biggest question. This is like not a great example because I know a lot of people have issues with this show, and it is a controversial piece. But when Hamilton came on Disney Plus, people were saying, I mean, aside from like glorifying slavery and all that, another comment that people were bringing up was, why can't all Broadway plays and other plays be
Yes.
streamed just like Hamilton, where tickets were like at an upwards of three? That was the first time I saw Hamilton, because it was like $300 to get a ticket for one of these things. And
Yes.
even Broadway plays, like I'm lucky enough to like have won like those lottery ticket like things
Yeah.
where I get like the $40 tickets. But even then, like $40 could be a lot for like a low income family who may want to take their kids to see Frozen, or um, you know, I don't know another Broadway, like I don't know another Broadway play. Oh my god, I'm
Yeah,
so
no, it's true. Like, like, why are you going to shell out a ton of money to see like Death of a Salesman again? Like, nobody needs to see a bunch of like old white men doing a really
yeah, that too.
self-indulgent show again. No, I like the Public Theater, which is in New York, and it does Shakespeare, but it does really like funny modern, not always funny, but really like modern interpretations most of the time, and it's completely free, and it's like a huge stadium theater, so it's like a totally different experience where like anybody can go to it. There's a long wait time, which is kind of inaccessible. Like you need to be able to like carve out a chunk of your Saturday and not be working. So it isn't inaccessible in that way, but it is completely free, which is totally accessible. And like, I don't know, I wish all theater was in public spaces and free. Yeah,
Yeah, same thing with Shakespeare in the Park, where I think it is free tickets, but
exactly.
you have to wait on this long line, and I don't know. I know my thing Shakespeare is a little problematic because it's so white and European, and we're
Right.
tired of these stories. But
Yes.
that's why I really love like what you and your friends did with Fresh Lime Co-Productions, right?
Yeah.
You're putting on plays that are diverse. You're not just like even focusing on like one type of South Asian, which tends
Right.
to happen in media, where you have
Yeah.
like you know light skin, pale skin
Yeah.
person, but like you're casting, at least from like the one play that I saw, you casted very diverse identities and very diverse like features and appearances, and it was just like an amazing, refreshing thing to watch. At least for me, at least it was just like it was. It's interesting because like the Ramayana play is actually something that was like interpreted, reinterpreted, like throughout like different cultures, including my own. So this is one of the most like interesting ones I've seen in my lifetime. Like where I was like, wow, like there's a story that I know from like childhood, and it's now casted in this very refreshing light, and it's just interesting what you do with Fresh Slime Co. And I'm like excited to see where this goes, like continues on, especially in a COVID world or even post COVID. Like I'd love to see like the plays and the productions that you and your company put on.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
gonna force you to come to all of our
I'm
performances.
coming. Like I'm gonna get all the tickets, and like of
Yes.
course like encourage other people to come and support. Because like this is theater. Like I think like that's the beauty of creation, especially when it comes from the folks in that community. It's real, it's authentic, and it really tells the story of that demographic, right? We don't need a Harriet Tubman movie that's written by a white person.
Right.
Like
Right.
why was that a thing?
Right.
Why we don't need, you know what I mean? We don't need like movies that talk about the Asian experience that aren't played by Scarlett Johansson. Like I'm
Yeah,
tired of this. Like I
icon.
don't, you know what I mean? Like I don't want to like die one day, have a biopic made of me, and have Scarlett Johansson play me. Like I mean, no, you know
That's
what I mean?
so
I'm like, is
I
that
by me in the, in the biopic.
if I saw it, I know I'm so like conceited. I'm like, oh, if I die, I'm like a biopic
Yeah,
amazing made of
exactly.
me.
No, I
But
love
but
always.
I think like yeah, of course. Like, and I think like that's what it is. I think like when people are behind the screens or behind the writing and they're folks from that community, you're able to tell more authentic stories. And I think that's what you're doing very well with Fresh Slime Co. Like
And you're
you're
able
doing
to
that
like
so well.
highlight different narratives that you wouldn't normally do. Like most like South Asian groups tend to be Indian and upper caste and Hindu. And there are a lot of upper caste Hindus based in the United States and New York in the group for sure. But I think we're really careful to say, all right, let's uplift different kinds of stories and different narratives. Like let's uplift stories of Malaysian Indians, like Ramayana specifically took the perspective of like Malaysian Indians. And so there were cultural nuances that, I chatted with the playwright about, like, why are you saying law in these lines? Or why are, or, just like specificities of like religion within the play that are different than what I know. So, how can we tell different nuanced stories that belong to us and don't belong to us? And also the epic took like a queer and feminist perspective, which I think it was challenging because like it's scary to like reinterpret like a pretty common myth. It's like the myth of Ram and Sita and take a totally different lens, especially with a religious story that people feel really like sensitive about and feel really protective over, and have like Ram and Ravana date. Like that's scary. But also I think that's the number one way you can challenge these canonical stories. Like, there's no use in saying, like, that's not true, that didn't happen, thus it's not problematic. It's better to say, like, how do we see ourselves fitting into these narratives? How do we see people we know and love fitting into these narratives? How do we make them more for us? And I think also, side note, doing a comedic interpretation is another great way of doing that because you're like, this is silly, and it's a silly story. Like, the fact that, someone gets kidnapped at the end, like, it's really misogynistic. Why not like poke at that and say how like these characters are really silly. And it's also like, it came out as like this anime and it also came out as like a serial in like the 1980s in India, and then like that came on VHS tapes to Queens and Nassau and New York and all over. And so my grandparents definitely watched it in the late 1980s. And this, like, a lot of like anthropologists talk about how because it like basically created this imagined community where like the like people who India belongs to are Hindus, and like to be part of this nation you have to be Hindu. That was kind of like the basis for a lot of Hindu nationalist politicians who are like, to be Indian you must be Hindu, to have access to our resources you must be Hindu, and now like to be a citizen and to have access to government infrastructure you must be Hindu. These are kind of all getting at the same things, especially because the Ramayana broadcast on national television and like everybody watched it and it was super ubiquitous. So I feel like there's a responsibility to take a feminist perspective, to take a queer perspective, to take alternative perspectives to these myths rather than like accepting them at face value. And we're certainly not the only people to like problematize the myth, but I also feel like I don't see a lot of people working within Hindu mythology, particularly within the diaspora. Like, I feel like that's not done as much. I feel like people are like, it's really complicated, or we're scared of Hindu nationalists, or we want to do plays about something else, or maybe let's just become investment bankers to not do it at all. But yeah, so it felt really important. And also, like, I think I said this at the beginning of the performance. So May, you probably already heard this, but it's like in doing plays that are like challenging systemic inequities, whether it's like anti-blackness or caste, you have to be doing kind of like you have to be like excavating issues within the community. It's not, you can't like just focus on anti-blackness without focusing on like nationalism and Hindu nationalism because they're kind of tied in together. Or like you can't focus on anti-blackness without talking about caste because all of these issues build together and you can't take them apart. So yeah, it's all important to do right now too.
Yeah, and like I think you did it in such like an interesting way, but also in a way that's like accessible for people to understand, right? So it's like something that like I think you took a very modern spin on a lot of it. Like you had like the calls and like the line chats and the references and the parties. I was like, okay, like it was something that you could relate to, but also get the message. Which like I think you did a very like you and your team did a great like reinterpretation of it. And I do agree. I think like stories. Like I mentioned this with like so I interviewed a lot of artists and content creators on this podcast. I don't even know if this is a podcast or a show. Whatever. This thing that
It's
I'm
an
doing.
audio visual experience
It's an audio visual experience. Thank you. An audio visual
sponsored by Under
experience.
Armour. You guys
Oh no, I can't. I wish they need to sponsor me. I feel like the amount of like I wear so much athletic clothing from them. It's ridiculous. But
okay, you need an athletic clothing sponsor. I'm just saying.
right, like someone please sponsor me. I could be a plus size model. But anyway, I think like art has a powerful way to convey a message. I think like that's from the shows we watch, the plays we consume, the books, the stories we read, from even the visual art that we see. It has such a powerful impact. And you know, if we're gonna do this content creation and like send a message out that calls in our communities about things like
Right.
anti-blackness, about casteism, about classism, colorism, you know, Islamophobia in a way. Let's, you know, do it in a way that's, you know, entertaining and fun for folks, but also has a message for them to kind of think at the end, like, wait, I saw this in the play today. Let me rethink about this and let me take this home and like really reflect on what I saw today. And I think you and Fresh Lime Co-Productions and the people that are involved in it have done a great job with doing that. I'm so excited to see going forward, like what you do with the play, even like with even like during COVID, after COVID, if somehow the miracle happens and like we have a vaccine and this thing is all done and we can go in person, you know. But I'm excited to see.
Canvas.
Oh my! Oh yeah! Like we can go campus. We can actually like do things. We can enjoy urban spaces and
Yes.
open spaces in peace.
We can meet now
Uh,
over Zoom. Oh my
oh
god.
yeah, we can. You and I can actually meet in person for the first
Literally.
time.
That's
It's
like the
so
wildest thing to me that we haven't met in person.
we haven't met, but yeah, it feels so
I
familiar.
know. I love it though. It
I
makes
love it.
me happy.
But like like you know before we wrap up I just want to say like thank you for coming on the show. I've been wanting to interview you. I think you're such an interesting person and just someone I like enjoy working with. Like I enjoy the calls and conversations we have. But before we come up on our like before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like me to promote on the show? So like obviously I'm definitely promoting Fresh Lime Co-Productions, like that will be a thing I'm going to promote with your episode. But is there anything else like projects, things, like any last words you want to say? Your Instagram, not your Instagram, something else. What do
Yes.
you want to like leave off with?
Yeah, definitely. Imagine if I was like, follow an urban research journal. I think it's, promote Fresh Lime Soda Co. That's great. Do follow it. If you're South Asian and do theater or cultural producing, please join us. We'd love to have you. We're very much about like anyone can join us, and we'd love to have anybody join us and create art with us. Particularly if you are like-minded in that you want to create really like exciting, accessible theater. Not like-minded as we have to have all the same ideas. Like-minded as maybe our approach to theater should have some commonalities. I would just say go follow Fresh Lime Soda Co. on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the things. We'd love to have you join us also. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sabina. Like I like super excited to see like where your first of all your urban planning journey goes to like how far you go, and I think you're gonna go so far. Like working with you has given me a lot of inspiration. You're very like intelligent and very like conscious about certain things. I've learned a lot from you, and like I'm excited to see the future of urban planning, and hopefully it is more community oriented. And of course, I'm interested to see even like how theater is like. I like the approach to it, especially with the young up and coming folks of color, femmes of color, women of color, taking the reins and like doing things. And I love independent like women and femme content creation, especially women and femmes of color. Like that is the best thing ever. So Sabina, thank you for joining me.
We work writing policy together is so enjoyable. Like even when we're working on like the nitty gritty of like special use planning, I'm like, oh, this is fun because Ben and I like our friends.
And you've made me like okay. for basically a background on me for our listeners, I used to work a land use fellowship that was like horrendous. Like I hated it. But like you made all of those experiences not go in vain. I'm like, thank you. It was useful for something. I like came out of it with some benefits.
I'll be like, what if you? I like read the summary on Local Law 87. Like, do you understand this? And May would be like, oh yeah, I just read the whole law.
Because I'm a lawyer.
I'm like, imagine having someone on your team like that. That's wild.
It's because I'm a lawyer, so I gotta look at things like very legal, or like I'm boring. Like that's
It's
what, like
so
my
and like
job is.
also like even the small things like capitalizing the C in city council. May is on and
Oh
off.
my god. It's because I used to work in media. I'm telling you, all my new, like, all my little nitpicking things. It's like my professional life coming seeping into activism, and I hate it. But anyway, Sabina, thank you so
Guys,
much. I like
fun
enjoyed
also.
it. I
Yay!
hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Fresh Lime Soda Co. is currently seeking plays by South Asian playwrights. If you are interested, please submit your work to the email above. Thank you.